for centuries. Stories about black people have been told not to reveal the truth, but to control it. These stories were repeated so often, across generations. Commissions classes, that many came to be accepted as facts. They appeared in classrooms, sermons, newspapers, films, and even in what was once called science. Over time, they shaped how societies justified slavery, segregation, and unequal treatment, often without question. But what if many of these beliefs were never true to begin with? What if they were carefully constructed narratives, designed to protect power, excuse exploitation, and silence entire communities? From distorted religious interpretations to flawed scientific theories, from biased education systems to sensational media portrayals, these ideas did not emerge by accident. They were built, refined, and passed down because they served a purpose. This story is not about blaming the past for the sake of blame. It is about understanding how misinformation becomes tradition, how repetition turns falsehoods into common sense, and how those ideas continue to echo in the present. When we fail to examine where these beliefs came from, we risk allowing them to quietly shape our thinking today. In this video, we will break down some of the biggest historical myths told about black people, where they started, who promoted them, and why they were so powerful. More importantly, we will look at what history, modern science, and documented evidence actually tell us, not opinions, not stereotypes. And facts, because truth matters, and understanding the past is one of the most powerful tools we have to build a fairer future. If you believe conversations like this are important, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with others who value history, truth, and critical thinking. Your support helps keep these stories alive and helps ensure that misinformation does not get the final word. Once those early stories were accepted as truth, they needed something stronger than opinion to survive. They needed authority. And so, across the 18th and 19th centuries, the language of science was recruited to give old prejudices a new appearance of legitimacy. Measurements, classifications, charts, and academic titles were used to present bias as objective knowledge, transforming social inequality into something that looked natural and inevitable. In European universities and American institutions, scholars claimed they could rank human beings the same way they ranked plants or animals. Complex lives were reduced to skull sizes, skin color, and crude categories. These ideas did not arise from neutral curiosity, but from societies already built on enslavement and colonization. The conclusions were written before the experiments began. When numbers appeared to confirm those conclusions, they were celebrated. When they did not, they were ignored or reshaped. These claims traveled far beyond laboratories. They entered school textbooks, popular literature, and political debates. They reassured those in power that inequality was not a moral failure, but a biological fact. If intelligence and ability were fixed by birth, then denying education, opportunity, and rights could be framed as order rather than injustice. Over time, repetition gave these ideas an air of permanence, even as they rested on deeply flawed assumptions. What is often left out of this story is how fragile those claims truly were. Many of the studies used small, biased samples, nearby manipulated data, or ignored environmental factors entirely. Later generations of researchers, using more rigorous methods, exposed these weaknesses and dismantled the foundations of scientific racism piece by piece. The authority once granted to these theories collapsed under closer scrutiny, though their cultural impact lingered far longer than their credibility deserved. Modern genetics tells a very different story. When scientists mapped the human genome, they discovered that the genetic differences between individuals labeled as belonging to different races are remarkably small. In fact, variation within any given group is often greater than variation between groups. Intelligence, creativity, and problem-solving ability do not reside in a single gene or cluster of genes, nor do they follow racial lines. They emerge from a complex interaction of environment, education, nutrition, health, and lived experience. Social science reinforces this understanding. When barriers to education are removed and resources are made accessible, performance gaps narrow or disappear. When communities face generations of restricted opportunity, the effects are visible not because of biology, but because history leaves fingerprints on the present. These patterns are not mysteries. They are outcomes shaped by policy, access, and circumstance. The story becomes even clearer when individual lives are placed back into the narrative. Across eras and continents, Black thinkers, artists, scientists, and leaders have demonstrated extraordinary intellectual range, often while working against systems designed to limit them. Their achievements were not exceptions to a rule of inferiority. They were evidence that the rule itself was false. What had been labeled as lack of ability was, in reality, lack of opportunity. Understanding this does more than correct a historical error. It reveals how easily authority can be used to disguise bias, and how dangerous it becomes when society mistakes explanation for truth. The myths of biological and intellectual inferiority were not simply wrong. They were useful to those who needed them to be believed. And recognizing that fact allows us to see the present with clearer eyes, aware that ideas, once embedded in culture, can survive long after the evidence against them is overwhelming. By tracing how these claims were built, challenged, and ultimately undone, the story reconnects with the larger theme we began with. False narratives do not endure because they are accurate, but because they are repeated, protected, and rarely questioned. When they are finally examined in full light, what remains is not a hierarchy of human worth, but a shared capacity shaped by the conditions we create for one another. As those false ideas about intelligence gained authority, they quietly spread into places where trust mattered most. Medicine, often viewed as a neutral guardian of life and health, was not immune. Instead, it became another arena where long-standing myths were given institutional weight, transforming prejudice into practice and leaving consequences that would echo for generations. During the era of slavery, the bodies of Black people were treated as tools rather than human lives. A dangerous belief took hold, the idea that Black individuals experienced pain differently, or less intensely, than others. This was not an observation grounded in evidence, but a convenient assumption that allowed suffering to be ignored without guilt. When pain was dismissed, cruelty could be reframed as necessity, and experimentation could be justified as progress. These practices did not end with the abolition of slavery. The same assumptions quietly moved forward into medical education and training. Textbooks repeated unproven claims. Students absorbed them as facts. Physicians carried them into examination rooms, often without conscious awareness of their origins. Over time, the myth hardened into habit. Complaints were minimized, symptoms were doubted, and suffering was too easily attributed to exaggeration rather than addressed with care. The result was not a single moment of injustice, but a pattern. Black patients were more likely to have pain underestimated, less likely to receive adequate treatment, and more likely to leave medical settings unheard. These experiences were rarely framed as bias at the time. They were explained away as clinical judgment, even when evidence suggested otherwise. In this way, a centuries-old falsehood quietly shaped modern outcomes. What makes this story especially powerful is how long it remained invisible to those who benefited from the system. Because the myth was embedded in training rather than openly declared, it was difficult to challenge. Those affected knew something was wrong, but lacked the authority to name it. Those in control often believed they were acting professionally, unaware that their decisions were guided by inherited assumptions rather than objective reality. It was only through sustained research and the courage of voices willing to question tradition that the pattern began to surface. Studies revealed consistent disparities in pain management and treatment outcomes that could not be explained by biology. When researchers accounted for injury severity, diagnosis, and access to care, the differences remained. The uncomfortable conclusion was unavoidable. The problem was not patients' bodies, but the beliefs carried into the room. Modern medicine now openly acknowledges this history. Genetic research confirms that pain perception varies between individuals, not racial groups. Medical organizations increasingly emphasize bias awareness, ethical standards, and patient-centered care. Training programs have begun to address how historical narratives influence decision-making, recognizing that neutrality requires active reflection, not passive inheritance. Yet the legacy of these myths has not disappeared. Trust, once broken, is slow to rebuild. Generations of unequal treatment have left deep skepticism toward institutions that once dismissed real suffering. Understanding this context is essential, not as a justification for division, but as a foundation for repair. Healing requires more than new policies. It requires honesty about how harm was normalized in the first place. This chapter of the story connects directly to the larger pattern we have been tracing. False narratives did not remain confined to textbooks or political speeches. They entered daily life, shaping experiences at the most vulnerable moments. When myths about humanity go unchallenged, they become systems. And when systems persist long enough, they begin to feel natural. Recognizing the truth behind these medical misconceptions does more than correct an error. It reminds us that knowledge is not fixed, that authority must be questioned, and that progress depends on listening to those who were once ignored. In confronting these stories, we do not weaken medicine or history. We strengthen them by aligning them closer to the reality they are meant to serve. As these misconceptions moved from classrooms and clinics into the wider public imagination, they found one of their most enduring forms in the idea of inherent criminality. This belief did not appear suddenly, nor did it spread on its own. It was built slowly, reinforced by law, amplified by media, and repeated through political language until it felt less like an accusation and more like an assumption. In earlier centuries, this narrative served a clear purpose. During slavery, portraying black people as dangerous or disorderly provided justification for constant surveillance and harsh punishment. Control could be framed as protection, and cruelty could be described as prevention. When slavery ended, the story did not disappear. Instead, it adapted. New laws emerged that criminalized everyday life, turning minor actions into offenses and reinforcing the illusion that the problem lay in people rather than in the system surrounding them. As legal structures evolved, so did storytelling. Newspapers, pamphlets, and later radio and film began to shape public perception. Isolated incidents were transformed into symbols, while broader contexts were left out of the frame. Over time, repetition blurred the line between representation and reality. The same images appeared again and again, creating a feedback loop in which fear justified policy and policy reinforced fear. Political language played its part as well. Calls for order and security often relied on coded narratives that linked danger to specific communities without naming the deeper causes of social instability. By focusing attention on individuals rather than conditions, these narratives redirected responsibility away from inequality, underinvestment, and exclusion. The story became simpler, but also more misleading. What is often missing from this account is the role of environment. Communities shaped by limited access to education, stable employment, healthcare, and housing face pressures that influence behavior across the world, regardless of race. Social science has long shown that crime rates rise and fall with economic stress, opportunity gaps, constant, and policy decisions. When resources disappear and options narrow, outcomes change. These patterns are consistent, measurable, and well documented. Yet the myth of inherent violence persists because it offers an easy explanation. It avoids difficult questions about how history shapes the present. It allows society to treat symptoms as causes and consequences as character. In doing so, it obscures the reality that many of the same neighborhoods labeled as high risk are also those that have experienced decades of disinvestment, surveillance, and exclusion from meaningful opportunity. Media coverage continues to influence this perception. Stories that fit familiar narratives receive attention, while quieter realities are overlooked. Everyday life, cooperation, creativity, and resilience rarely make headlines, even though they define far more of the lived experience than conflict ever could. When visibility is selective, understanding becomes distorted. This distortion has real consequences. Policies built on fear rather than evidence tend to deepen the very problems they claim to solve. Over-policing, unequal sentencing, and limited paths to reintegration reinforce cycles that are then cited as proof of the original assumption. The story feeds itself, gaining strength not from truth, but from repetition. Connecting this chapter to the broader narrative reveals a consistent pattern. Just as flawed science once tried to define intelligence, and false medical beliefs dismissed suffering, this stereotype redefines circumstance as nature. In every case, complexity is reduced, context is erased, and inequality is made to appear inevitable. Understanding this does not require denying that crime exists or that communities face real challenges. It requires recognizing that causes are not inherent, but constructed over time through policy, access, and history. When those factors change, outcomes change with them. By tracing how this stereotype was formed and sustained, the story returns to its central theme. Myths endure when they serve power, not when they reflect reality. Challenging them is not about rewriting history, but about finally seeing it whole, with all the forces that shaped it brought back into view. As scientific language and political systems worked to normalize inequality, another powerful source of authority was drawn into the story: religion. For societies that shaped their moral world through sacred texts, spiritual justification carried a weight that no law or theory could rival. Once belief is framed as divine order, questioning it can feel like defiance rather than reflection. This is how one of the most enduring distortions took hold: the so-called curse of Ham. The biblical story itself is brief and ambiguous. It speaks of a family conflict, a moment of shame, and a curse placed not on Ham, but on his son Canaan. There is no mention of skin color, no reference to Africa, and no suggestion that entire populations were marked for servitude. Yet over centuries, this small passage was stretched far beyond its original meaning. Interpretation became invention, and invention became doctrine. As transatlantic slavery expanded, this reinterpretation served a clear function. By linking blackness to a divine curse, human exploitation could be reframed as sacred destiny. Enslavement was no longer merely economic or political. It was presented as fulfillment of ancient prophecy. This shift was crucial. It removed moral responsibility from those who benefited and placed it onto the supposed order of the universe itself. These ideas did not circulate only among the uneducated. Clergy, theologians, and writers gave them structure and authority, embedding them into sermons, books, and teachings. Over time, repetition transformed speculation into certainty. The story became less about scripture and more about reassurance that an unjust system was somehow righteous. What often goes unspoken is how selective this reading was. The same religious tradition contains countless passages emphasizing human dignity, shared origin, and moral accountability. Yet those themes were sidelined. Interpretation followed power, not principle. When belief aligns too closely with convenience, it becomes less about faith and more about control. Serious biblical scholarship eventually dismantled these claims. Linguistic analysis, historical context, chemistem's plasism, and comparative theology all pointed to the same conclusion. The curse of Ham as applied to black people was a fabrication. It reflected the anxieties and interests of later societies, not the intent of the original text. Scholars across cultures and denominations rejected the idea, affirming that it had no legitimate theological foundation. Despite this rejection, the damage lingered. Once religious authority had been used to sanctify inequality, its echoes continued. Even after the original arguments were discredited, beliefs passed through generations do not disappear when corrected. They fade slowly, often surviving as cultural assumptions long after their theological basis has collapsed. This distortion fits seamlessly into the broader pattern we have been tracing. When flawed science defined intelligence, when medicine dismissed suffering, and when law equated circumstance with criminality, the goal was always the same: to make inequality appear natural and unavoidable. Religion, when misused, offered the final seal of permanence. If injustice was God-ordained, then resistance could be framed as rebellion against the divine rather than a demand for dignity. Understanding this chapter is not an attack on faith itself. On the contrary, it reveals how belief can be separated from its ethical core when filtered through systems of power. Many religious leaders and communities have since confronted this history directly, acknowledging how sacred language was manipulated and working to realign faith with justice, compassion, and truth. Seen in this light, the story of the curse of Ham is not merely a historical footnote. It is a lesson in how meaning can be shaped, how authority can be borrowed, and how deeply ideas can root themselves when they promise moral comfort. Once again, the pattern holds. Myths endure not because they are true, but because they are useful. By bringing this distortion back into the open and placing it alongside the others, the narrative becomes clearer. Falsehoods rarely operate alone. They support one another, forming a framework that appears solid until each piece is examined. When that happens, what collapses is not belief or history, but the illusion that inequality was ever justified in the first place. As we arrive at the end of this story, one final idea must be confronted, because it ties together all the others: the belief that African and black societies were somehow primitive, isolated, or insignificant in the broader flow of human history. This notion did not emerge from evidence, but from silence. Achievements were ignored, histories were excluded, and entire civilizations were pushed to the margins of the global narrative, not because they lacked substance, but because acknowledging them would challenge the stories that justified domination. In reality, Africa has never been a blank space on the map of civilization. Long before colonial contact, complex societies flourished across the continent. Powerful kingdoms governed vast territories, cities supported centers of learning, and trade routes connected Africa to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Wealth, knowledge, and culture moved along these networks, shaping economies and ideas far beyond the continent itself. Gold from West Africa influenced global markets, while scholars preserved and expanded knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Technological innovation was not absent. It simply followed different paths. Advanced metallurgy, agricultural systems adapted to diverse environments, architectural achievements built to last centuries, and written scripts used for governance and scholarship all existed well before external intervention. These developments did not require validation from outside powers, yet history often recorded them only when filtered through foreign eyes, if at all. The myth of primitiveness survived because it was useful. It made conquest seem like progress and exploitation appear as guidance. By redefining achievement according to narrow standards, entire histories could be dismissed without being examined. What was lost was not just recognition, but perspective. When contributions are erased, humanity's shared story becomes smaller, poorer, and less accurate. Reclaiming this history does not mean replacing one myth with another. It means restoring balance. It means understanding that civilization has never had a single center or a single direction. Knowledge has always been cumulative, built across cultures, continents, and centuries. Africa and black societies were not passive recipients of history. They were active participants and contributors, shaping the world in ways that are still felt today. Seen together, all the myths we have explored follow the same pattern. Intelligence was misdefined, suffering was dismissed, character was distorted, faith was manipulated, and history was narrowed. Each falsehood reinforced the next, creating a framework that made inequality seem reasonable and exclusion appear natural. When that framework is dismantled, what remains is not chaos, but clarity. Understanding this past is not about reopening old wounds. It is about preventing them from quietly repeating themselves. Truth creates responsibility, but it also creates possibility. When history is told fully, it allows societies to move forward with honesty rather than inheritance, and with understanding rather than assumption. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on this journey through history. If you found this story meaningful or informative, please support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps ensure that these conversations continue, that overlooked histories are explored, and that truth has the space it deserves to be heard.